Let's talk about something that is particularly relevant right now on this July 2026 episode of Road Life Hub. Let's talk about how to survive a heat wave while living in your vehicle. At exactly this time last year, I was work camping in Darien Lake, New York. I was living in my Kia Sorento, which most of you know as Jewel, and I had a pretty good little setup. I thought I was prepared for the summer. What I wasn't prepared for was a stretch of temperatures close to 100 degrees combined with the humidity around 80%. There's something very different about experiencing that kind of heat when your home is a car. In a regular house, even without central air conditioning, you usually have more space. You can go into the basement. You can close the curtains and move to a cooler part of the house. The walls are insulated. The air doesn't change temperature nearly as fast. A vehicle is different. It is a small metal and glass box sitting outside in the weather with you in it. I remember sitting in my car one afternoon, watching the thermometer I keep in there. It went up to 99, then 100, then finally it reached 101 degrees. I just sat there looking at it. I had 3 fans running. My Aluminet reflective tarp was over the car. The windows were covered with reflectix or screens. The screen tent allowed me to leave the car door open and still have some protection from bugs. I had done all the things I knew to do, but there was no cool air anywhere for the fans to move around. The Aluminet was actually doing its job, which is to keep the car at a temperature no higher than the outside. Whereas it can easily climb to 130 degrees or higher in an uncovered car in full sunlight. The problem was that outside was already over 100 degrees. The campground bathroom was quite a walk from where I was parked, and during normal weather, I enjoyed that walk. During that heat wave, I started thinking, how bad do I really need to go? Sometimes I just use my little portable potty since the car and the screen tent blocked the view of me sitting on it. When I did have to walk through the heat to the bathroom, by the time I came back, I would be exhausted. Not tired from exercise, exhausted from simply moving my body from one place to another. I had always associated heat exhaustion with people doing something strenuous outside. But there were days when I was barely moving and the heat still seemed to drain everything out of me. I would become so lethargic sitting in the driver's seat that there were a few times when I think I may have briefly lost consciousness. I can't know for certain exactly what happened because I was alone. But I remember becoming aware again and wondering whether I had fallen asleep or actually passed out for a few seconds. At the time, I did what I think a lot of vehicle dwellers do. I didn't immediately think, this is dangerous. I thought, what else can I try? So I developed a routine. Every hour or so, I would take a half gallon of water and dump it over my body. I would let it soak my hair, my shirt, and my body, and then I would sit in front of a fan. I kept a towel soaking in water and wrapped it around my neck. When it got warm, I would soak it again. I had a spray bottle beside me at all times, and I sprayed my arms, legs, and face. Then I let the fans blow on me and give me some temporary relief. That became the rhythm of those hot days. Spray myself with water, wipe with the towel, sit in front of the fan, dump water all over my head, wait for relief to disappear, and then start again. And all of those things helped. That's important to say. The fans helped, the water helped, the shade helped, the Aluminet helped, but none of these things changed the weather. That experience reinforced one of the biggest lessons I've learned since I started living in my vehicle. Weather isn't something I check for before a trip anymore. Weather helps decide where I go. I didn't understand that when I was first starting to travel. One of the first places I went after leaving Vermont was North Carolina. There was no great strategic reason for going there. I wanted to go because I remembered North Carolina from when I was in my teens. I had romanticized it for years. I remember the scenery and the feeling I had when I was there. And somewhere along the way, I had created this idea that I would go back someday, maybe even live there. Then, many years later, I finally had a home on wheels and the freedom to go wherever I wanted. So I went chasing the North Carolina I remembered. What I hadn't really considered was what it would feel like to sleep in a car in that climate. It's funny how differently you experience a place depending on how you're living in it. A warm, humid evening can feel wonderful when you know you're going back into a cool house or hotel room. It feels very different when you know you're going back to sleep in the vehicles that has been absorbing that heat all day. I learned pretty quickly that the place I loved in my teens was not necessarily the place I wanted to live in a car in the summer in my 50s. So I started changing the way I planned my travels. Now I look at much more than the daytime high. I look at the overnight temperature because a hot day is much easier to handle if the air cools down after sunset. I look at the humidity. I watch for storms and high winds. I think about whether I will be camping somewhere that allows me to spread my Aluminet over the car. When temperatures are going to be above 75 degrees, I start thinking very carefully about where I'm going to sleep. If I'm parked in a parking lot or somewhere I can't set up my Aluminet, my options are limited from when I'm camping somewhere that I can put it on. I have screen sleeves that fit over my doors so I can lower the windows without filling the car with bugs. Unless you're standing close to the vehicle and looking for them, you may not even realize the windows are down. I also installed rain guards. Those were one of those small purchases that turned out to be much more useful than I had expected. They let me keep the windows down a few inches for ventilation while keeping the opening less obvious from the outside. Then there are the fans. People sometimes ask me how many fans I have, and the answer changes because I seem to collect them. But when it's hot, I usually have at least 3 going. I have USB fans, sometimes cordless rechargeable fans, and sometimes ones that plug into my portable power station. I try to create movement throughout the vehicle. One fan might pull air from one direction, another may circulate air around the sleeping area, and another is aimed directly at me. But again, there is only so much that fans can do when all they're moving around is extremely hot air. And that brings me to the most important lesson that I've learned about the heat. Sometimes staying safe in your vehicle during extreme heat means not being in your vehicle. I've spent hours wandering around Walmart with absolutely no intentions of buying anything. I have sat in fast food restaurants for longer than it took me to eat my meal. Libraries are wonderful. So are malls. Even laundromats can become a place to cool down for a while. When you live in a vehicle, you start seeing ordinary places differently. A library isn't only books and computers. On an extremely hot day, it can be a safe place where I can sit in an air-conditioned room for a few hours, use the restroom, connect to Wi-Fi, and sometimes charge my smaller devices. A fast food restaurant can be a place where I buy an inexpensive drink, sit quietly in a corner, charge my phone, and let my body cool down. That doesn't mean I walk away from my car and forget about it. One of the complications of vehicle living is that you aren't the only thing the heat can affect. Almost everything I own is inside Joule. You know, my car. My laptop may be in there. My power stations are in there. My refrigerator is running. There are batteries and electronics and charging equipment that I don't want baking inside an unventilated vehicle all afternoon. Before I go somewhere to cool down, I prepare the car as much as I can. I put up the window coverings I made using Reflectix, which I lined with black felt to help keep the inside darker, which also helps keep it cooler. I take advantage of those rain guards and leave the windows open enough to allow some air movement. Sometimes I'll leave a small USB fan running. And I don't disappear for an entire day without thinking about what's happening inside my vehicle. Because that's another thing I've learned. Vehicle dwelling is not just about managing yourself. You're managing a tiny household. You are constantly thinking about your water supply, your power supply, refrigeration, ventilation, shade, where you're sleeping, where you're going to park, and what the weather is about to do. Most of the time, I don't mind that. It's part of the lifestyle. But during extreme heat, all of those little systems matter at once. I think older nomads need to be particularly honest with themselves about this. I spent a lot of time around desert nomads, and I've noticed that some people get to the point where they barely acknowledge the heat anymore. They walk around outside in extreme temperatures as if they don't realize it's 100 degrees. Maybe after years of living in the desert, it does feel normal. But normal and safe are not the same thing. I've seen people spending hours outside without much protection from the sun, and I sometimes wonder whether we are so focused on surviving today's temperature that we aren't thinking about the damage that is happening to our unprotected skin over time. And there's another challenge to living alone on the road. When you're alone, there may not be another person watching you closely enough to notice that something has changed. Nobody there to say that you're acting confused, to notice that you're showing signs of heat exhaustion or even heat stroke. You have to monitor yourself, which is difficult because one of the dangers of becoming seriously overheated is that your own judgment may not be at its best. Looking back at the summer in Darien Lake, I understand something now that I didn't fully understand when I was sitting in the driver's seat watching the thermometer reach 101. I was putting all of my attention into tolerating the heat. I kept asking myself, what could I do to make it more bearable? Another wet towel, more water, another fan, more airflow. But I wasn't asking the more important question soon enough. At what point is it no longer something I should be trying to tolerate? At what point do I say it's time to find somewhere cooler to go? That's a question I want people to think about before they find themselves in that situation. Don't wait until you're sitting in a dangerously hot vehicle, exhausted and unable to think clearly before trying to decide where else you can go. Look around before the heat arrives. Find the library, find the mall, know which restaurants or stores are nearby. Watch the forecast several days ahead instead of just checking this afternoon's temperature. Pay attention to the overnight lows. Think about whether your campsite will allow you to create shade. And notice ahead of time what will make you change your plans, because sometimes the plan needs to change. That doesn't mean you weren't prepared enough. It doesn't mean you aren't tough enough. And it doesn't mean you failed at vehicle living. One of the greatest advantages of living this way is mobility. We can move with the seasons. We can go higher in elevation. We can travel north. We can change direction because a heat wave is coming. Mobility only works when we are willing to use it. I learned a lot sitting in that car in Western New York. I learned that shade can keep a vehicle from becoming dangerously hotter than the outside temperature, but it can't make a 100-degree day cooler. I learned that fans are valuable, but they're not magic. I learned that a public library can be as important to a vehicle dweller as a piece of camping equipment. I learned that there is a difference between making an uncomfortable situation more tolerable and making a dangerous situation safe. That's a distinction I pay more attention to now. This is the kind of thing we talk about here on Road Life Hub, especially for older adults and people with disabilities who are living in vehicles or considering this lifestyle. I love the freedom of being on the road. I wouldn't still be doing it if I didn't. But freedom doesn't make us immune from weather, age, illness, or the realities of living in a small metal box. We have to understand the risks so we can make better decisions about them. Because freedom has a price, and that price is responsibility. I'll see you down the road.